A common apologetics making the rounds amongst Muslims, and a sense of boast for them propagated by videos such as these, among the many claims made by the protagonist. But for the purpose of this video, time-stamped at 2 minutes 15 seconds, is the claim that the Quran uses the title of Pharaoh more accurately compared to the Bible, thereafter triumphantly deriving the conclusion that the Quran could not have copied from the Bible. Essentially, the crux of the argument is the title Pharaoh for the ruler of Egypt only came into vogue as late as Egypt's 18th dynasty. This would fit with the time of Moses. However, earlier rulers of Egypt during the time of the patriarchs, such as Abraham and others, were simply called kings. Thus, the Quran's use of king at the time of Joseph, who lived around 1700 BC, and the use of Pharaoh for the time of Moses, who lived around 1300 BC, is justified, versus the Bible's use of Pharaoh across both periods. This article by the Armstrong Institute of Biblical Archaeology explains this contention in full. The link is below. In order to analyze the Islamic claims, a timeline needs to be established. Islamic sources do not give a timeline for Moses' lifespan independently from their own sources. Instead, the timeline they base their arguments upon is deduced from Jewish and Christian sources, and even these do not always correspond. For example, rabbinical Judaism, such as Seder Olam Rabbah's Babylonian Talmud, calculates Moses' time corresponding to around 1300 BC. St. Jerome, in his Chronicon, suggests around 1600 BC as to his birth year. Suppose the latter date of St. Jerome's is taken, then that will fall outside the historical timeline for calling the ruler of Egypt Pharaoh. However, the Quran in verse 28:8 talks about Moses' birth and calls the ruler at the time Pharaoh, when he should have been called king, according to their own argument. But they will probably selectively adopt the former timeline as it suits their argument better. An adjunctive to this is the Quran's curious connection of a figure called Haman to the Pharaoh story, a topic covered in the book Islam the Honest Truth and will be covered in a later video. In spite of all this, the point is to make their argument. Muslims are drawing upon the information contained within Judaic and Christian sources and not from their own, and on top of that, they selectively cherry-pick whichever makes their case better. The word Pharaoh itself is ultimately derived from the Egyptian compound Par, which means great house, written from the two biliteral hieroglyphic symbols. In the common vernacular, the term Pharaoh is used to refer to all the rulers of Egypt from the first dynasty to the last one, as the term itself had existed from over 3000 BC. But like any language, it undergoes changes, as it says in the Britannica that the term Pharaoh was not used for a ruler until 1500 BC, and even when it was a metonym, which means used as a substitution of a name, of an attribute, or an adjunct for the actual thing meant. The Britannica also clarifies how it was initially referred to the House of the Kings, then to the kings themselves, then as a title of respect, but note, it was still never the formal title of the kings of Egypt at all. Consequently, what this shows is that the term was in use before Moses' time, but it underwent changes. The term Pharaoh was used in the early period to refer to the royal house, and its use as a generic title for all monarchs came through the Hebrew Bible. So for the Quran to be really accurate, something that the Bible does with some of Egypt's rulers and the Quran does not, is it could have mentioned the actual name of the ruler rather than the generic title of Pharaoh for the ruler at the time of Moses. Thus, based on this information, it really cannot be said that the Quran does anything groundbreaking. The Karnak priestly inscriptions, especially fragment 3b, lines 3-5, year 17 inscription, is an important paleographical development, as it is the first time in Egyptian recorded history where it employed the term pharaoh as a title and linked it directly to a king's name, and this was in relation to Pharaoh Seaman, who reigned between 986 to 967 BC during the 21st dynasty. Henceforth, references to subsequent successors were then called pharaohs, where it became commonplace. Prior to Seaman's reign and all throughout the Middle and New Kingdom, the word pharaoh generically referred only to the office of the king. Note, this would have included the pharaoh at the time of Moses. More research on this can be done in the work by Egyptologist John Murray Cruikshank. The very first books of the Bible, called the Torah, dates to around 500 BC, and it was written by multiple authors over a long period of time. It therefore went through a process of composition, transmission, and preservation. Part of this process included the updating of place names and political titles to terms that were known to later generations. In this article called Torah.com, it explains this in reference to Pharaoh. So if understood in this context, it is not an error at all. Rather, it is called an anachronism, which is used in written literature since time immemorial till now. If one points to similar problematic passages in the Quran which fall beyond a certain timeline, Muslims are also quick to invoke it. This will be shown next. Nonetheless, such anachronisms in words typically are used for clarification purposes, in that it is a later, typically better known name given to something from an earlier, lesser known time period for purposes of clarity. For example, history books and articles often describe how Julius Caesar conquered France. But at the time of Julius Caesar, France as a country did not exist. The area was known as Gaul at the time. But the anachronism France conveys more meaning to a modern audience. Therefore, by saying France, the author is not implying that it existed at the time. It is so that the readers would understand by merely using it as a modern reference point. By the same token, at the time of the Old Testament composition, the word Pharaoh was universally understood to refer to the ancient rulers of Egypt, regardless of their time period. Further reading about this can be done in the World History Encyclopedia. If Muslims want to be consistent by laying the charge of keeping names and titles to their official designations confined to their actual timelines, then the Quran fails in this respect, as it does not always uphold to this standard. But here is when the apologists will then shift the goalposts and say it is an anachronism. For example, when it is pointed out a currency called dirham did not exist at the time of Joseph in 1700 BC, when he was traded for a few dirhams in Quran 12:20. The name dirham is derived from drachma, a Greek coin first introduced in 6th century BC, that is over 1,000 years after the time of Joseph. But if they want to be consistent, as they do with the name Pharaoh, then why didn't the Quran use the name of the actual currency at the time of Joseph, as opposed to one that did not exist at his time? Here notice how they invoke anachronism in this case. Also, what they fail to admit is the Bible is more accurate than the Quran in this case, because the currency shekel did exist at the time of Joseph, first attested in 2150 BC, and also mentioned in the Code of Hammurabi. Therefore, it could have been used to trade Joseph with, but never with the dirham as mentioned in the Quran. There are numerous other duplicitous double standards amongst Islamic apologetics. However, for brevity's sake, one more will be given. If Muslims want to get pedantic over names and titles, and only use the official terms for people as is historically and officially accurate, then why does the Quran also impose its own terminology on characters? One such example is Potiphar, an Egyptian name which the Bible uses, but the same person is given the Arabic title of Al-Aziz in the Quran. This Arabic term would never have been used by the Egyptians during Joseph's time, a term that would have been unknown to them, nor is it an ancient Egyptian name unlike the biblical Potiphar. For example, in Quran 12:51, Allah calls Potiphar Al-Aziz. It is often argued by Muslims that the name is apt, as it is translated as the Mighty One, because he was a governor in charge of the storehouses of Egypt, and was called this as a title in conjunction with him being a powerful man in the Egyptian administration to denote his high rank. But the point remains, this term was not the original name or title for Potiphar. Why are Muslims not consistent in their use of original ancient Egyptian phraseology to show the Quran is historically and archaeologically accurate, just like they do with the Pharaoh title? Also, generally, a benevolent figure in the Quran for taking care of Joseph, Potiphar, is given one of Allah's names. This is obviously sacrilegious due to the definite article al in front of his name. The irony is, this is something Muslims also admit as blasphemous. Quran 30 verse 5 uses the same word to describe Allah. So for Potiphar to be called Al-Aziz cannot really be better than using his actual Egyptian name. Further, in Genesis, Potiphar's wife is given no name, nor is it in the Quran, to be fair, but according to Islamic sources, his wife's name is Zuleika. This name is not derived from any ancient Egyptian records. It is a Hebraized name adopted from later Jewish sources. So here is another example where at times Muslims are content to adopt non-Egyptian unofficial names, whilst at the same time the absurdity of modern-day apologists boasting about getting names or titles accurate. Also, the comparison between the Quran and the Bible is not a fair one. If the New Testament is included, the Bible is 10 times more voluminous than the Quran. Therefore, statistically, the Quran has a higher probability of getting some things correct by sheer coincidence alone, as it has a much smaller sample size to prove from. To give an idea of the false equivalence between the two books, the Quran is slightly smaller in volume than the first 5 books of the Old Testament alone, the Torah. So despite giving the impression that the Quran accurately portrays later Egyptian rulers as pharaohs and earlier rulers as kings, the Quran only mentions 2 rulers of ancient Egypt generically, the pharaoh at the time of Moses and the king of Joseph. Furthermore, the most mentioned figure in the Quran is Moses, who is mentioned over 100 times. As such, the term Pharaoh is employed numerous times. Conversely, the Egyptian king reference at the time of Joseph is only mentioned a handful of times, and that is within a comparatively brief passage of scripture found within Quran chapter 12. Therefore, statistically, due to a good-sized data set, one can therefore expect to find a significant number of references in the Quran to the Pharaoh of Moses rather than that for Joseph. It still stands, it is logically problematic to hold up a relatively minuscule data set as proof of the Quran's accuracy. Compare this with the biblical account, which mentions well over a dozen different rulers of ancient Egypt, including mentioning some of them by their personal names, such as in 1 Kings, where it names Shishak, also known as Shoshank. This type of detail and accuracy is not found in the Quran. Contrary to the claims of the apologists, who imply the Bible is less accurate as it does not make a distinction between terminologies by saying the Quran gets it correct when it uses the word king in reference to Joseph's story, which in Arabic is Malik, by the way, a term that is taken from the Hebrew melech. They conveniently omit that the Bible uses both Pharaoh and the term king for Egypt's rulers. In fact, in connection to Joseph, the Hebrew term melech is used to refer to the king of Egypt. Example of Genesis 39:20 is shown here, but it is also found in other places such as Genesis 40. Joseph's ruler is also called king in the New Testament in Acts 7:18. As it's the New Testament, the Greek term for king is employed. Also, the Bible, unlike the Quran, uses both terms to refer to the king of Egypt in the account of Moses, such as in Exodus 6:11 and 6:13. Indeed, the parts of the Quran that mentions Joseph's king of Egypt largely parallels the same section of the Bible in which the specific term king is used. The verses in which the Quran's king of Egypt is referenced, namely chapter 12, and its retelling of the story of Joseph, mirrors that as told in Genesis chapters 37 to 50, where he is depicted as Jacob's favored son, sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, seduced by Potiphar's wife, imprisoned, eventually rising to a powerful position in Egypt through his God-given ability to interpret dreams, and ultimately reconciling with his family by saving them from famine, showcasing themes of forgiveness, providence, and God's ability to use even difficult situations for good are the very same themes found in the Quran. As an illustration, notice Quran verses 36 to 37 and its parallels to the biblical account of Joseph's time in prison, as found in Genesis 40, where the term king is used for the ruler during Joseph's time. So in conclusion, without needing to rehash the subject, to quote William Shakespeare, this is a case of much ado about nothing by the Muslim apologists. There is not anything revelatory or unique about their arguments. These are people who follow a religion that gleefully fed off the Bible, but at the same time insidiously seeks to destroy it, than solely to elevate the Quran and their religion. These apologists, especially those who live in the West, are driven by an inferiority complex in which they are too arrogant, ignorant, or intellectually dishonest to admit, who endlessly resort to inane, childish point scoring in order to try and make converts to their religion and recruit more imprudent apologists to their pernicious cause.